Okay, I am standing here in Frederick County, Maryland, and I'm looking at a sign that says, "Welcome to Pennsylvania, Adams County." This video series that we're doing is going to be called Forward, for God's Sake Forward, John F. Reynolds at Gettysburg. In his last day on the earth, John F. Reynolds, on June the 30th, passed into Gettysburg from Maryland on this road. On June 30th, he would go up this road about 1.5 miles, and he would stay at the Moritz Tavern. And on June 30th, he would spend the final night of his life at the Moritz Tavern. Just previous to him, John Buford's cavalry rode up the same road, went to the northwest of town, and they noticed in the distance to the west Confederate activity. He realized very quickly that the Confederates were coming to Gettysburg or headed in this direction in force. He sent back a horse rider, probably to the Moritz Tavern where John Reynolds had spent the evening of June 30th, 1863, on the morning of July 1st, 1863, and told him to get his corps into town with all possible speed. Now, the 1st Corps and the 11th Corps were behind us in the distance in Maryland, in Thurmont and in Emmitsburg, Maryland. So these riders dispatched were to immediately get these 2 corps and move them forward on this road. And we looked at this in our video series, the 1st Corps arrival at Gettysburg, and as well as the 11th Corps arrival at Gettysburg. This video series will trace the final day of John F. Reynolds' life from the time he entered Pennsylvania till his death, northwest of town on Seminary Ridge. This has been Forward, for God's Sake Forward, John F. Reynolds at Gettysburg, Part 1 on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. God's Sake Forward, Part 2 on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. And I'm here on the Emmitsburg Road today, and I'm looking at the Moritz Tavern. Now, the Moritz Tavern was built, the left side of this house was built in the year 1787. The right side was an 1820 addition. Now in 1787 there was a liquor license that was applied for, where it had become Moritz Tavern. Now Moritz Tavern once stood on a major intersection which used to go on the other side of the house. And this connected such cities like Pittsburgh with Baltimore in that direction. So this was at one time sitting on a road that was a major intersection. And that road today no longer exists. It was done away with when the modern Route 15 was built in, and of course places like the Gettysburg Auto Auction were built. But remnants of that road are still over here in the distance. Now, in 1822, it became Merck's Tavern. Now, the one thing that's really special about this building is that it was here on the evening of June the 30th, 1863, that Major General John Fulton Reynolds spent the last evening of his life in the summer kitchen behind the tavern. John Reynolds, of course, in command of the 1st Corps, spent the final evening of his life, and we got a visitor. Here. He spent the last evening of his life, and it was here where he received messages in the night of June 30th into the 1st of July of 1863 from General Buford, John Buford, that there was a battle erupting on the northwest side of town in the distance over here at the seminary. John Reynolds spent the evening of June 30th in the summer kitchen along with his staff officers in this house. During the night, he became very uncomfortable as he spread across some chairs, and he would later lay on the floor. Of course, on July 1st, he was summoned to the battle in Gettysburg and made his way up the Emmitsburg Road here into Gettysburg through the town, as we'll see in our next set of videos. And of course, he was killed on July 1st, 1863 at 10:15 in the morning. This has been Forward, for God's Sake Forward, John F. Reynolds at Gettysburg, Part 2. on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. Forward Part 2A on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook, and I'm behind the Moritz Tavern now, here looking at the old summer kitchen, and I've been given permission to go up and get a close-up to it as I can. This is the summer kitchen where John Reynolds spent the final evening of his life on June 30th, 1863, in here. Of course, like I said, during the night he became very uncomfortable laying on those chairs, and he later slept on the floor. Now, what happened here also was that the chairs later made their way, and today they are actually in the visitor center of the Gettysburg National Military Park. But this little room here that we're looking at here in front of us was actually the spot where John Reynolds spent the final evening of his life on June the 30th, 1863. And of course the summer kitchen has been modernized now and made into a modern kitchen, as you can see here. But that room is very solemn. General Reynolds spent the final evening of his life there on June 30th, 1863. The next day he would be killed in battle near the Lutheran Seminary on July 1st, 1863 at 10:15 in the morning. This has been Forward, for God's Sake Forward, Part 2A, John F. Reynolds at Gettysburg on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. God's Sake Forward, John F. Reynolds at Gettysburg, Part 3 on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. And I am here at the Sherfy Farm, near the Peach Orchard on the Gettysburg National Military Park. And it was here on the very early morning of July 1st, 1863, that Major John Fulton Reynolds and his First Corps of Infantry passed right by this farm on their way to Gettysburg. Now in our last part, Part 2 and 2A of Forward, for God's Sake Forward, we were at the Moritz Tavern, and we had talked about John Fulton Reynolds receiving an order to proceed to Gettysburg with all possible speed, that a battle had been breaking out. The Moritz Tavern is about 2.5 miles south on the Emmitsburg Road. So he and his troops, with him at the lead, on horseback, headed in this direction, and they passed by the Sherfy Farm here in the early morning, about 7:30 to 8 o'clock in the morning of July 1st, 1863. And it was here at this farm, I guess somebody recognized me from online, but it was here at this farm that John Reynolds passed by. And it was ironic enough that the very next day, on July 2nd, 1863, and John Reynolds by that time had been killed, that this farm would again erupt in battle. The barn would be burned to the ground, and inside of the barn, men from the 114th Pennsylvania Volunteers, also known as Collis Zouaves, and you can see their monument. We also did a video on Collis Zouaves here at the Gettysburg National Military Park. But the Collis Zouaves burned alive in the barn. The Sherfy Farm was the scene of some very heavy fighting here on July 2nd as Barksdale's Mississippi Brigade crossed this farmland en route into that direction over there. This has been Forward, for God's Sake Forward, John F. Reynolds at Gettysburg, Part 3 on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. God's Sake Forward, John F. Reynolds at Gettysburg, Part 4 on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. And I am here now at the Nicholas Cordori Farm and Nicholas Cordori House here on the Gettysburg National Military Park on the Emmitsburg Road. In Part 3, we left off in the distance about a mile at the Sherfy Farm. Now, John F. Reynolds at the head of his First Corps made their way up the Emmitsburg Road here on the morning of July 1st, 1863. And when they got to the Nicholas Cordori farm, something strange happened. Now, a little bit about the farm. The house was a cattle farm. This farm grew and slaughtered cattle and took the meat, or actually raised the cattle, and they were slaughtered and then taken into the town of Gettysburg, to where the Cordori family owned a meat market. Today that place is called the Brafferton Inn, or other words known as the Hoke Cordori House. But this was the farm where the cattle was raised here. When John F. Reynolds got here in the morning of July 1st, 1863, he was at the head of his column of his First Corps troops. And when they arrived here to this little hillside next to the house, something strange happened. The strange thing that happened here was that John Reynolds and his staff, including his orderly, Charles Henry Vale, separated from the First Corps. Now, John Reynolds and his staff would proceed straight into the town of Gettysburg. They would go into the Gettysburg town. They would meet several civilians. They would get a look at what the town was laid out like and its streets, which became very evident. Because when he met Buford at the seminary, in a little while we'll talk about that, it was there that his original plan was, when they have to fall back, they'll fall back and fight inch by inch through the town. The reason they were able to say that is because the plan was that Reynolds, since he had got a good look at the town on the way in, would know how to fight through the town and defend it inch by inch. Now, Reynolds rides straight into town. However, the First Corps stops here and cuts in this direction to what was the William Bliss farm. Now, we did a video series on the William Bliss farm and its role in the Battle of Gettysburg on July 2nd and 3rd, 1863. The Bliss farm, of course, burned down. It was burned down by Connecticut troops, the only farm to be burned down by Union troops during the battle. And it was no man's land. But its place in history on July 1st was it was passed right by the First Corps troops on the morning of July 1st, 1863. Reynolds and his staff heading into town. And in our next few videos, we're going to be in the town of Gettysburg, passing by different spots that John Reynolds passed by. But here, in part 4, we are at the Nicholas Cordori farm. Here, where Reynolds, this is probably the last place that John Reynolds marched on the Emmitsburg Road before he was separated from his First Corps troops, and then would not be reunited with them again until they were out on Seminary Ridge near the Lutheran Theological Seminary, and not long after that, he was killed. And we'll look at that in our last part videos here on this video series. This has been Forward, for God's Sake Forward, John F. Reynolds at Gettysburg, Part 4, here at the Cordori House on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. Sake Forward Part 5 here on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. And we are here on Steinware Avenue in front of what today is Servants Old Time Photographs. This building in 1863 was the home of a man named George. Now, the building dates back to the late 1700s and most likely was built by the same builder that built the Dobbin House. In 1863, this building was owned by a man named George, and as General Reynolds made his way into the town of Gettysburg, he passed right by this house. As soon as he passed this house, he would then turn to the left onto Washington Street. Now, the thing that is ironic about this house is when John Reynolds is killed, he is carried to this house, his body rather, is carried to this house and laid inside just under this window here. On a table while they waited to get a casket made for him. And then from this house, he was taken up the Taneytown Road into Taneytown, Maryland, and then from there to Baltimore by train. From Baltimore, his body was taken by train to Philadelphia to his sister's house, and then once again put on a train on the evening of the 3rd and taken to Lancaster, where his funeral was on July 4th of 1863. So General Reynolds passes by the George house in the morning of July 1st, 1863, and then just an hour or two later he's killed in battle, and his body is carried back here, most likely by members of the 76 New York Volunteers under Lysander Cutler. From a lot of research that's been studied, it looks like his body was removed from the field by the 14th Brooklyn, or members of the 14th Brooklyn, and taken over to the seminary, then carried here by aides and members of the 76 New York Volunteers to this house. A casket was found. Then the body proceeded to Taneytown, Maryland, from there by train to Baltimore, then from Baltimore by train to Philadelphia, and then once again by train to Lancaster, where he's today buried in Lancaster cemetery. It is ironic that he passes by this house, and then just an hour or two later he is killed, and his body is brought back to this house and laid here on a table under this very window. I will, in the future, a friend of mine actually owns this photography studio here. I may get Kevin Servant to shoot a video talking about and showing the inside of the house as well. But this has been Forward, for God's Sake Forward, John F. Reynolds at Gettysburg, Part 5, on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. Sake Forward, John F. Reynolds at Gettysburg, Part 6, on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. And the house that we're looking at was built in the year 1832, and it was known as the Andrew Culp House during the Battle of Gettysburg, owned by a member of the Culp family, the famous Culp family that resided here in Gettysburg. It was built by the same builder that also built the Mary Thompson House, which was known as General Lee's headquarters and still is today. So the house looks exactly like a twin of General Lee's headquarters. Now here, after proceeding past the George house, Reynolds turns onto Washington Street and rides by this house. As he approaches this house, women come out of this house and offered water to Reynolds and his staff, and also later on to soldiers in the 11th Corps who would pass by this very house up Washington Street. Washington Street was also the scene on the afternoon and evening of July 1st, 1863, of the battle as it raged through the town of Gettysburg. And it would scar many of the houses. We're going to take a look at this gray house up here in our next video, known as the Stock House, which is the most battle-scarred house in Gettysburg. This has been Forward, for God's Sake Forward, John F. Reynolds at Gettysburg, Part 6, on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. And I do want to mention that I've done a video series on the Andrew Culp House where I actually take you inside the house and also up to the attic. Today, it's a part of the Wellspan Internal Medicine Health Center as it sits here next to the Gettysburg Hospital on Washington Street. This has been Forward, for God's Sake Forward, John F. Reynolds at Gettysburg, Part 6, on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. Okay, this is going to be Forward, for God's Sake Forward, John F. Reynolds at Gettysburg, Part 7, on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. And the house that we're looking at here is the Jacob Stock House. It sits here today at 407 South Washington Street. It is a brick house that was built in the year of 1859. It was a brand new house, just a couple years old, when Reynolds passed by it on July 1st, 1863. That morning, as he passed by this house, it was a red brick house. It was new. The bricks were nice and pointed. There wasn't any kind of battle damage on the house whatsoever. Within a few hours, this house would change forever, as today it is the most bullet-riddled house in the borough of Gettysburg. Hundreds of holes lining both the eastern and southern end walls of this house. But it's been hit on all four sides. It was owned by a man named Jacob Stock, and it was also used by Confederate sharpshooters as they dueled with Union sharpshooters on Cemetery Hill. On the morning of July 1st, as Reynolds and his staff passed by this house, however, it was a brand new house, just a couple years old, built in 1859. This has been Forward, for God's sake forward, John F. Reynolds at Gettysburg on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. For God's sake forward, part 8 here on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. And I'm here near the intersection of Washington Street and High Street. And it was here that John Reynolds, when he reached this intersection, made a left and headed toward the Lutheran Seminary. Now, a few places he would have passed. The first one would have been this greenhouse here, which is the Jack Hopkins house. Now, Jack Hopkins was an African American, and he was also a janitor at Pennsylvania College. To the right is the Eister Finishing School. This is the building in which Tilly Pierce, on the morning of July 1st, 1863, was at in school when the battle erupted and the instructor sent the girls home. And ironically enough, just a few hours later after that happened, this house was struck by an artillery shell. In the front here, you can see it just up here by the windowsill. This was also the first home of the Gettysburg College and the Lutheran Seminary before the complexes were built. But as he made his way here, this house right here is the James W. Foster house. Now, this house was also built in the year 1859, like the stock house. He rides up to this intersection. He makes a left here at the Foster house. Now, when he gets to this house, two women came out of the house and began to have a conversation with Major General John F. Reynolds, saying that there was a battle happening at the seminary complex. Reynolds advised these two women to get back into the house before they get struck by some type of projectile and killed. Now, they did not know at the time, but these women had hid two Union surgeons, one by the name of Thomas H. Beck, and the other one by the name of J. Theodore Herr in this house. They hid these surgeons, Union surgeons, in this house away from Confederate fire. Now, the seminary is just to the west of us in this direction. So the house had a balcony which sat. Now, as Reynolds was talking to them, several projectiles hit the side of the house in which the porch is on here at the top. And of course, the women, being scared now, believed what John Reynolds said and rushed inside this house. Again, this is the James W. Foster house, built in the year 1859. And if you actually look at the top here, there is a little marker that says built by James W. Foster in 1859, sitting here right in the side of this brick wall. This has been Forward, for God's sake forward, part 8 here at the Foster House on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. This is going to be Forward, for God's sake forward, John F. Reynolds at Gettysburg, part 9, here on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. Now, on the morning of July 1st, 1863, just behind me, of the Lutheran Theological Seminary, John Buford and men from the Signal Corps like Aaron Jerome watched the battle as it broke out. This was about 9:30 in the morning as they observed the Confederate troops advancing on Seminary Ridge. About that same time, Major General John F. Reynolds, arriving from the Foster House in this direction, arrives here at the Lutheran Theological Seminary. Now, Jerome goes to him that he is to bring up his troops. Buford says, hurry up, they're driving in my pickets. A man named Captain Wells tells Reynolds that he fears that they may get to the heights before he does. And Reynolds is given orders by these men to get his first corps here with all possible speed. This is the first time that General Buford and General Reynolds meet, though Buford has sent him messages telling him to get here. Now, General Reynolds arriving here at the Lutheran Theological Seminary, this is where he actually takes command of the battlefield. Buford will then himself go up into the cupola of the Lutheran Theological Seminary and observe the battle. And from what he sees up there in the cupola of the Lutheran Theological Seminary, that is what gives him the command to come into this field, place certain troops at certain positions. For instance, as he sees Pegram's artillery to our west along the Chambersburg Pike on Hare's Ridge, he knows that Pegram's artillery must be dealt with, so he will later place a battery of Union artillery to duel with that artillery and also to buy him time to bring in his Iron Brigade. This all takes place here at the Lutheran Theological Seminary around 9:30 in the morning of July 1st, 1863. This has been Forward, for God's Sake Forward, John F. Reynolds at Gettysburg, Part 9, on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. This is going to be Forward, for God's Sake Forward, John F. Reynolds at Gettysburg, Part 10 on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. Now, while John F. Reynolds is discussing with General John Buford in this Lutheran Seminary cupola about the oncoming Confederate attack and also the placement of his troops, it is here that he states that his corps would be on line soon and that he would fight the enemy inch by inch through the town if necessary to prevent them. He would barricade the streets if necessary, and that is the reason that he rode through town and not with his First Corps troops on foot through the William Bliss Farm. While in town, he got a good lay of the land and he got a good look at the town to see what would be needed if an attack was to go over this ridge toward the town, and they would have to fight their way inch by inch through the town. Now, just after this, as his troops begin to come online, John F. Reynolds rides in this direction to the west. As he rides this way, he begins the placement of Lysander Cutler's brigade in this area over here, including a main battery, which we'll take a look at in our next video, that he personally places himself over here along the Chambersburg Pike to duel with Pegram's Confederate artillery. This has been Forward, for God's Sake Forward, John F. Reynolds at Gettysburg, Part 10, on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. Okay, this is going to be Forward, for God's Sake Forward, John F. Reynolds at Gettysburg, Part 11, here on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. And I'm standing here, and right in front of me is the Major General John Fulton Reynolds monument, Esquire in statue rather. And behind me is Paul's second main battery. Now, when John F. Reynolds leaves the Lutheran Theological Seminary, he comes in this direction, crosses the Chambersburg Pike, and again he sees Pegram's Confederate artillery to the west. Just to the right of the John Buford statue, you can see a red roof in the distance. That's the roof of Hare's Tavern today. Pegram's artillery is firing into Buford's exhausted cavalry troops here at 9:45 in the morning of July 1st, 1863, when Reynolds, coming from the seminary, personally places Lysander Cutler's brigade. Now, the second main Paul's battery is actually at the back of the marching line, and they are forced to cut in front of the 147th New York Volunteers of Cutler's brigade to get to this position where John Reynolds personally places their guns right here where they sit today along the Chambersburg Pike. Now, the objective was to draw the fire from Buford's brigade while Reynolds' troops are getting in the line, and while Buford's exhausted cavalry troops can be pulled out back into reserve so he can relieve them. This ends the placement of Cutler's brigade here. John Reynolds only has about 25 minutes to live, and we'll examine those last 25 minutes of his life in parts 12 and beyond. This has been Forward, for God's Sake Forward, John F. Reynolds at Gettysburg, part 11 on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. Forward, for God's Sake Forward, John F. Reynolds at Gettysburg, part 12. Here on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. In our last video, we left off just in the distance in front of us where you can see the main battery. Now, John Reynolds rides in this direction over here, and when he gets here, he personally places the 95th New York Volunteers here at the Edward McPherson farm. Now, today you can see the McPherson barn in the distance. What many people don't realize, because most of the time it's overgrown, is there is a small marker to the 95th New York Infantry on July 1st, 1863. And then it says 10 a.m. Now this is one of the least visited markers on the Gettysburg battlefield because usually it is overgrown. But it also gives a clue, and the clue is 10 a.m. John F. Reynolds is still alive at 10 a.m. in the morning on July 1st, 1863. From there, he rides, as we walk now, over toward the 84th New York, which is also known as the 14th Brooklyn. Now, when he gets over here, he has a conversation with Colonel Fowler. Now, no one today knows exactly what was spoken by John F. Reynolds, Major General John F. Reynolds, to Colonel Fowler at about 10:03 in the morning of July 3rd, 1863. Because remember, he does place the 95th New York at 10 a.m. after placing Lysander Cutler's brigade and the main battery on the Chambersburg Pike. He rides over here, and just within a few minutes, he has a conversation with Captain Fowler. And most likely, that conversation were orders of what would happen in battle. No one knows that for sure, but from this point here, from the 14th Brooklyn and the conversation with Colonel Fowler, John Reynolds then rides off in this direction along Herbst Woods, and then over there in that spot would be the end of his life on the morning of July 1st, 1863. This has been Forward, for God's Sake Forward, John F. Reynolds at Gettysburg, part 12, on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. Forward, for God's Sake Forward, John F. Reynolds at Gettysburg, part 13, on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. I have a few notes I want to read from here on this part. It was here, in this spot, that Major General John Fulton Reynolds was placing the Iron Brigade about 10:05 in the morning of July 1st, 1863. Now, the men of the Iron Brigade were coming from where the camera is facing toward me in a southeasterly direction. John Reynolds, riding right here, says forward into line, forward at the double quick, forward men, and drive those fellows out of that wood. Now, the brigade paused right here and began to load their weapons. As they reached this area in echelon, they collided with Archer's brigade in the woods right over here. Now, Archer's brigade fired one volley, and that first volley killed 75 men from the 2nd Wisconsin. Lieutenant Colonel George Stevens was killed. Lieutenant Lucius Fairchild lost his left arm. Now, it's at this point that the story and the mystery of John F. Reynolds' death becomes very critical. As this brigade, coming in echelon, the Iron Brigade, passes him and collides with Archer's brigade, the 2nd Wisconsin passes Reynolds. And that's really important. As soon as they pass Reynolds, He's turned in the saddle. He turns in the saddle with his back facing Herbst Woods, and instantly a ball from a downward trajectory hits him behind the head and the ear and knocks him off his horse, killing him instantly. In our next part, we will talk about the controversial death spot of John F. Reynolds and its most likely location. This has been Forward, for God's sake, Forward, John F. Reynolds at Gettysburg, Part 13, on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. For God's sake, Forward, John F. Reynolds at Gettysburg, Part 14, on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. And we're going to talk about the controversial death spot of Major General John Fulton Reynolds, who was killed here on July 1st, 1863, around 10:15 in the morning. Now, we just left off as the 2nd Wisconsin passed Major General Reynolds. He turns in the saddle. He's struck as he turns from behind the back of the head by a bullet, a mini ball that instantly killed him. And over the years, the spot where he was actually killed has been debated. However, some of the biggest clues are the placement of the monument and 4 photographs that were taken between the years 1866 and 1880. Now, the monument, which you see in the distance to John Reynolds, sits about 30 yards away from where I'm standing. That monument was dedicated in 1886, and it marks the general vicinity of where Major General John Fulton Reynolds was killed. However, there were no living eyewitnesses to Major General John Reynolds' death at that time. In fact, his orderly, Charles Henry Vail, was not alive when that monument was dedicated. So we got to go back to Charles Henry Vail and the photographs that were taken. The first photograph was taken by Hanson Weaver in 1866. And it's taken from about where the camera is right now, looking in this direction. And it's a tree that sits right here today, where the right flank marker of the 151st Pennsylvania is. And on that tree is carved an R. The other 3 photographs that are taken later on up to the 1880s are taken closer to the vicinity of where the monument is today. And all 3 of those photographs have signs or a headboard laying at the base of the tree that says, "Here fell General Reynolds." But one of the most important documents was a letter that Charles Vail, the eyewitness to John Reynolds' death, wrote to lawyer David McConaughey in 1864. And he writes, "While in Gettysburg recently, I was at the spot where General Reynolds fell. I think you will have no difficulty finding it. It is a large white oak tree on which I cut a large letter R. Nearby, in the distance, stands a smaller oak tree in which I also cut a letter R." The other photos, like I said, have the signs nailed to them that say, "Here General Reynolds fell," or a headboard at the base of the tree. However, the Hanson Weaver photograph, which is taken right where my camera is today, depicts the large oak tree standing right here today where the right flank marker of the 151st Pennsylvania is, that has a letter R carved in it. And Vail writes, less than 1 year after Gettysburg, to a lawyer here in Gettysburg, that is the spot where Major General John Fulton Reynolds was killed on the morning of July 1st, 1863. So it is my belief that right here, where this right flank marker sits, is where the real monument to John F. Reynolds' death, not the monument that was placed in 1886 in the general vicinity, should be. This is the spot right here where Major General John Fulton Reynolds' life ended on July 1st, 1863. This has been Forward, for God's sake, Forward, Part 14, John F. Reynolds at Gettysburg. Okay, this is Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook, and I have a treat for you all today. I'm standing here with an old friend of mine, Kevin Servant, who runs the Servant's Old Time Photography here at the George House, and he is going to give you a few minutes brief history of this house and what happened here. Kevin?
This is the George House. General Reynolds was brought here on the first day after he was mortally wounded and killed on the first day. And this is the front door that he was brought in. They brought him in and laid him out in this area. This is the house. This is the structure of the house, right inside of the house. Over to this side is the back door to go outside. And when this house was built, it was built by Alexander Dobbin. And it was used for their servants and ranch hands that lived here. But during the battle, it was owned by a gentleman named George, and he owned it for 1 year. Anything else?
And you said from this house, Reynolds was brought in the front door, laid in this vicinity,
laid in this area,
on a table.
He was laid out for a few hours. They made a makeshift coffin for him, and then they shipped him down to the train station. And then he went from the train station to Washington, D.C., and then back to Lancaster, his hometown in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and was buried on July 4th.
So there you go, folks. This is the historic George House here in Gettysburg. Today it's used as a photography studio where you can get like a souvenir photograph, old-time photograph.
Correct.
And I've done it myself. It's kind of cool. So if you guys are in Gettysburg and come and visit, please stop in here and get a photo taken, you and the kids and the family. And again, just to recap, John Reynolds, after being killed on the 1st of July, was held briefly down at the Lutheran Theological Seminary near the library there, brought here through this front door, laid here in this vicinity where a makeshift coffin was made, and his body was prepared. And then as they left the house, they headed up the Baltimore Street over to past this town diamond at the time to the Lincoln train station where he was taken from there to Washington. Okay, this is going to be our final part on the For God's Sake Forward, For God's Sake Forward, John F. Reynolds at Gettysburg. And we're here in Lancaster, and we're at the grave of Major General John Fulton Reynolds. And as we looked at his last 24 hours of life in Gettysburg and then talked a little bit about his post-life, his story about where his body was moved, and John Reynolds ends up back here in his hometown of Lancaster, and he's buried here in Lancaster Cemetery, and this of course is his grave site. He was the highest ranking Union officer killed at the Battle of Gettysburg about 10:15 in the morning of July 1st, 1863. And this is John Fulton Reynolds' final resting spot. He's buried here with family. The obelisk that you see here is the original gravestone, and then the one in front of it was put up in 1989. We'll go over and take a look at it.